Good afternoon, everybody. This is the side event on Indigenous Peoples, Strategic Partners for Financiers of Climate Adaptation. My name is Vicky Tauli Corpus. I am a Kankanaey Igorot from the Cordillera region in the Philippines, and I'm the Executive Director of Tubtuba and the former UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'm welcoming you to this event, and just to give a little introductory remarks, Indigenous peoples, as we know, are very interconnected with nature. We live in harmony with nature, and our resilience is deep-rooted in traditional knowledge, as our capacities to adapt to environmental change is based primarily on profound understanding and our spiritual relationship with our lands and territories. Despite being the least responsible for climate change, we are among the most vulnerable rural communities that urgently need to take action to adapt to it. At the same time, we are responding and adapting to climate change in unique ways, in which we use our traditional knowledge systems, which is an extensive source of ecosystem-based adaptation that's essential to combating climate change and protecting biological diversity. This event is meant to provide an opportunity for IFAD to show to its commitment to engage with Indigenous peoples as strategic partners for climate adaptation. And we also invited other development actors that contribute to its work, especially through the Indigenous Peoples Assistance Facility, an innovative funding instrument that fosters self-driven development. And it's foreseen that its cycle for 2022 will focus on climate change adaptation. I would like now to welcome the one who will provide the opening remarks. She is Jo Puri, who is the Associate Vice President of the Strategy and Knowledge Department at IFAD. She leads the organization's strategy work in IFAD's key areas, targeting agriculture, climate, gender, nutrition, youth, and social inclusion. She has worked previously with the Green Climate Fund, UNEP, and the World Bank, among others. I would like to ask Jo Puri to welcome us.
Thank you so much, Vicky. Ladies and gentlemen, it's such a privilege for me to be here today with all of you. We know that 80% of the world's biodiversity is located on lands that are indigenous. These are indigenous territories. We also know that indigenous peoples are both leaders in the cause of adaptation, but are also recipients as well as key stakeholders in adaptation as well as mitigation. Indeed, through many of the instruments that IFAD is supporting, but especially the IPA, or the Indigenous People Action Fund, Assistance Facility, I beg your pardon, we are able to work with Indigenous people so that we can recognize their leadership in showing to us what works when we are managing the trade-offs between climate and environmental sustainability on one side and livelihoods on the other. And guess what? Most of us here think of these as trade-offs, but we know that there are lessons to be learned from Indigenous peoples' territories and Indigenous peoples' practices that we can take and learn from and scale up. So that's one very important factor that we take into consideration when we think of social inclusion, but also when IFAD includes and thinks about participation and social inclusion. The second aspect of this is recognizing that, like the chair said, Indigenous peoples are also amongst the most vulnerable when it comes to climate change uncertainty and climate change shocks. What can we do in this context? I think the clarion call for adaptation funding is out there. We know that we require approximately $300 billion every year for us to cover the adaptation gap that most developing countries witness. But we also know that a large part of that does need to be targeting indigenous peoples, because unless we are able to do that, we are not going to be able to ensure that there is survival. IFAD is putting its money where its mouth is. Since the beginning of its operations, IFAD has approved more than 240 investments that target at least 42 million indigenous peoples. Currently, our portfolio provides financial support to approximately 6.5 million indigenous people. Ladies and gentlemen, so far we have supported 160 projects in more than 45 countries just through the Indigenous People Assistance Facility. With the support of SIDA, the Swedish bilateral agency, we are going to be putting out a call early next year that will be focusing on learning, but also supporting indigenous people and their practices towards building greater resilience to climate change. Please come and join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jo. That is really a very good representation of what IFAD has been doing for indigenous peoples. I always cite IFAD as a good practice in terms of UN agencies working with indigenous peoples. Now we will move to the virtual presentation, the videos that are made by our partners in Paraguay and India. We will see Pedro Marengo, a traditional leader of the community, implementing the project improvement of the quality of life of the Toba, Kum, indigenous community. And after this film from Paraguay, we will see the film from Pragati in India with the project Empowering Tribal Youth for Nutritional Food Security and Income Enhancement in Koraput district of South Odisha. So let's see their messages in video.
Reforestación.
Youth are the backbone of the country, but the rural youth are not inclined to agriculture, which is a threat to future food security. Pragati Koraput and Koraput Jilla Banbasi Sangha, with support of IFAD IPAF, is implementing a pilot project.
Estamos acá en nuestra propia tierra, que es Tobacón, Valladolid, que nos
We are here in our own land. It is called Adea Kumbogaran, which was given to us by the state through the INDI. Here there are many possibilities for us, for agricultural production, livestock farming. There are fields, mountains. We can get our food here. For example, honey, wild animals, and we go fishing. Here we still find raw materials for our crafts, karandi, palm trees. There are work opportunities because our identity is identified in our culture. Our ancestors show us how we have to face diseases. In this place, we find medicinal plants. The support of FEMI, IPAF, and SATOC is important. We all have our own vegetable garden. Vegetables, lettuce, onions, tomatoes. It is important for our diet and nutrition.
El proyecto también incluye la reforestación.
The project also includes reforestation because here also affects the plantations, animals, and I'm also thinking of flooding and droughts. They affect all of this too, and we have to combat it through reforestation.
Youth are the backbone of the country, but the rural youth are not inclined to agriculture, which is a threat to future food security. Pragati Koraput and Koraput Jilla Banvasi Sangha, with support of IFAD IPAF, is implementing a pilot project for empowering youth in agriculture for nutritional food security. Through trainings, exposures, intergenerational exchange of knowledge, and critical input supports, the youth are now involved in crop production in their family farms.
मो जमी रे पानी एते सुविधा नथिला प्रगति तरफरु डीबीआई पानी भी एबे सुविधा अछि आ प्रगति तरफरु मोर प्याज एडा मंजी जाक ऑपरेट रे दिया हला आ एडा सब जाक लगेइछु आ ए मका जाक भी आमे लगेइछु आ साडे धनिया पत्र भी लगेइछु
मो प्रथम थर चाष करछि पनिपरिबा प्रगति तरफरु हमको देचंते बियान जाका आगु कुआरे बोला हले यार करबी बोली बाबचे.
The traditional food crops like millets, tuber crops, pulses are being revived. The indigenous seeds are conserved and replicated. Organization of youth into producer groups have built solidarity. The youth groups are supporting the elders in conservation of biodiversity and resources. During the time of COVID-19 pandemic, the youth volunteered to action to support their communities. There is further need of development of infrastructures, increased access of youth to information, resources, technology, and develop youth entrepreneurship in agriculture and allied sectors for their dignified livelihoods.
Thank you very much. And now we will have the opportunity to meet Rose Kabashinga, who is an indigenous Batwa woman, and she has a story also from ProDefi, an IFAD-funded project in Burundi. She has become the role model for her community, and we will watch two videos they have sent from Burundi, where Rose shares with us the challenges she is facing as an indigenous Batwa woman, given the current impacts of climate change and how IFAD has supported her livelihood.
Au Burundi, la communauté autochtone Batwa représente.
Burundi, the Batwa indigenous community represents 1% of the total population. At a time where more than 80% of the population lives from agriculture and livestock, the Batwa still live from basic clay work. Nowadays, for pottery to be a source of income, it has to be modern and industrial. The Batwa also face many problems and prejudices. These include not being able to raise a cow, whereas in Burundian culture, owning a cow inspires respect and symbolizes wealth. Rose Kabashinga, an indigenous rural woman, changed this thanks to the gift of a cow she received from a project funded by the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, in 2014. Since then, Rosa's family's lifestyle has amazed many. She has become a role model for her community. Our lifestyle was very precarious. Since we had little source of income, we did not have enough to eat. I begged from people. They would show me where I could grow food. I taught my children how to sell their labor. Sometimes they would bring back 1 franc and in the evening we could eat. Sometimes they would go in pairs and bring back 2 francs. We were sure to eat that day and the next day. Even if there was no one to give us work, we still had hope. We learned the techniques to raise cows, how to feed them, how to give them water, how we would plant fodder grasses, how we would build a barn. We were very diligent in these trainings. After finishing the trainings, since I was chosen among other Batwa, I was very happy. But before I got the cow, I was in danger of not getting enough to feed my children. Now, when I plant a banana tree, I am sure to have a large diet at harvest, whereas before, it only carried 1 or 2 portions of bananas. My peers look at me and say, yes, she's doing really well. She got a cow, she's thriving. Not long ago, no Mutwa was raising a cow. Today, I could consider myself a role model.
Guhindagurika ry'ibihe imisozi byose byarahindutse aho byahora byarahindutse imisozi irabomoka ikabomokera mwakura ryabo.
In these times of climate change, the situation is no longer the same. The mountains are collapsing and burying the extraction point for clay, the only raw material that my community Batwa used to live on. It is increasingly difficult to find other extraction points. When the activities of ProDefi reached us, I was thankful enough to participate actively, as the pottery is gradually dissipating. I registered in the category of those who will receive cows. I had the opportunity to participate in the draw, but people wondered if I would manage to raise a cow. Soon after, my name was on the list of the beneficiaries. I was delighted. I kept asking myself if I could really raise a cow. We formed groups that received training in animal husbandry. Then we planted fodder grasses. I was so happy when the cows came to our hill. I said to myself, Rose, you are going to be prosperous. I took care of the cow. Curious people came to see if I was really raising a cow. When she gave birth, I started drinking milk. My children were healthy. Sometime after I started drinking milk, I noticed that there was a change in my weight and health. I no longer feel the weight of age. My children are, most of the time, cheerful. I urge them to feed the cow, as she, in turn, gives them milk. Since I decided to apply the good practices that ProDefi taught me, I have a better life than before the cow arrived. I have the assurance that my family will be well fed. I often remind them to get on with farming because there is manure. That is why I will always be grateful to ProDefi. The project has made me prosperous. Thanks to ProDefi, I'm able to produce food and to feed my immediate and extended family. The climate is no longer favorable. Bad weather causes famine. What will happen to my most disadvantaged fellow human beings in these times of climate change? My closest relatives who live on this site sometimes come to work in my fields. Most of them are my family members. If I have green bananas, I give them a diet. And if I have beans, we share them.
Thank you very much, Rose, for those videos that you showed us. Now we have, we were supposed to have Jackie Macaria present with us, but she got sick. No, so she's still connect with us, but through video. So I'd like to invite Jackie, who is the coordinator of the Indigenous Peoples Assistance Facility in Africa. Jackie, you have the floor.
Thank you, Vicky. Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think I was supposed to answer the question on what are the main characteristics of Indigenous people solutions for climate change adaptation and to share some examples. So I want to start by reiterating something that we are all familiar with. And I think one of the main characteristics is that of Indigenous people's interaction and worldview of land. I want to believe that before we even talked, next slide, please. Before we even talk about land use changes and plans, as a term we now use, this is something that indigenous communities were already doing and now has become even more useful with the effect of climate change in becoming more visible in their lands. So land is not just about its economic value, but it is a source of life, and it's also providing value for their well-being. And so one of our projects in DRC, as you can see on the screen, did a land use plan for an area called Busisi. This is a pygmy community in DR Congo, and they noticed that fish was disappearing in this area and their rivers were starting to dry up. So they set aside land in the forest areas where, to demarcate forest areas, areas for agriculture, areas for living, and also areas for grazing during dry and wet seasons. So that's one of the projects that worked on climate change adaptation, on climate change adaptation. Next slide, please. One of our other projects, also in DR Congo, this is a project that recognized that their community forests were becoming degraded. And so what they chose to do, and this is actually a double-edged sword, if I may call it that, it's both an adaptation and mitigation project. So here they're planting trees that can hold moisture for a long time. And secondly, hopefully those trees will in future become a source of carbon capture. Next slide, please. So these two young men are guardians of a water point. Unfortunately, the photo is not well able to show the water point behind them, but that's a water point that's sitting right behind them. And what was happening in this area is because of changes of weather, the water point was drying out. It was getting, the water was actually getting eroded because of, silt and, livestock stepping on it. And this water point was so critical because it's a source of water for both the Hadzabe community. Those two men are from the Hadzabe community in Tanzania, and also a wildlife corridor. So, and the Hadzabe depend on wildlife as their source of food. So what they did was set aside this land to become a water point that is being protected, that's being rehabilitated. And as a result, they've started seeing wildlife actually crossing back again in this area. Next slide, please. The next characteristic I want to talk about is livelihood diversification. What we're seeing in indigenous communities, especially the hunter-gatherer communities who were actually living in the forest, and many of them, apart from climate change effects, are actually being displaced from those ancestral homes. So many of them have taken up, let me say this before I continue, that most of these communities depend on wildlife and forest products. So displacing them from those areas, them getting affected by effects of climate change means they lose their source of livelihood, they lose their source of food. And so many of them have started taking up other livelihood practices. For example, if you look at the photo on the left, you will see they've started working on crossbreeding small livestock that are drought resistant, that are resistant to diseases. And the photo on the right, they are taking up waste materials like newspapers and old magazines, and they're processing them into jewelry like beads. Next slide, please. The other characteristic that we have seen in indigenous communities is biodiversity conservation. I specifically want to talk about our project in Morocco, where they were preserving the argan tree. That's the tree you see on your left. And the products you see on the right is the argan oil, which is a very high value product in the beauty industry right now. And as a result, this plant is actually being over-harvested. It's also being cut down for charcoal. So, and it's a very important plant. The argan tree has the potential to hold moisture for, I think, up to 7 years. So it thrives very well in the desert. It's very good for, drought, stress and water stress. So our projects have been trying to ensure that this plant is preserved and is sustainably used. Next slide, please. And finally, I just want to talk about this. We don't yet have projects specifically addressing this thing, this area, which is early warning systems, especially for droughts and floods. But I felt it is important to mention that in some of my supervision missions, I have noticed that, elders will reroute us sometimes 2 or 3 days and tell us there's a huge storm that's coming. These are communities that don't have atmospheric gauges or, any other equipment, to be able to detect that this is what is going to happen. So they will reroute us and tell us you need to walk, go this direction or this other direction, so that you don't come in case, you don't come across floods. And so one of the things we are picking out is that it is important to use traditional knowledge, because the indigenous communities have such a deep understanding of how nature works. And sometimes it's very difficult to articulate this, Sometimes it's just a knowing that they have, but that has a potential, and I say this with a grain of salt, to be developed in robust science. And I think we have opportunities here to begin to help these communities, because like it has been said here, they are the most vulnerable. When these droughts happen, when the floods happen, they are aware that these things are going to happen, but they have no ways of being able to address this. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Indeed, you have seen the virtual presentations, and you can understand more concretely what we mean when we say that indigenous peoples are trying their best to adapt and to be resilient to climate change. And the underpinning factor in their capacity to do this is because they possess the traditional knowledge and innovations, and practices, and these are being used for them to be able to adapt. The last point mentioned by Jackie, for instance, about the early warning systems, I think that's one of the things that indigenous peoples are very good in. They are able to detect when storms are coming and when there are droughts, and for them to be able to adapt to that, they have that knowledge, and they are capable of adapting even before some of the disasters happen. So I think this highlights exactly what we mean when there is traditional knowledge, innovations, and practices are important. And as many of you will know, there is now a formal constituted body here in the Climate Change Convention called Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform for sharing traditional knowledge. And 2 days ago, some traditional knowledge holders have come here to speak, but it would have also been good to see these videos that speak about how the people are using their knowledge and innovating and adapting. The resilience that you see is demonstrated by the fact that some hunters and gatherers have to move to settled agriculture because that's the option that they have when they are displaced from their forests. It doesn't have to be like that, but with the reality that they get displaced, how else will they survive if they are not training themselves to be able to undertake agriculture or take care of a cow? In the past, they just rely on wild foods and wild animals, and now they have to domesticate animals so they will be able to survive. So now I would like to move to a video message from Carla Lara, who is a Honduran Alenka performer, and she's a singer-songwriter, a journalist, activist, and human rights defender. Her music expresses protest and social consciousness, feminism, and she is also a strong ally of COPIN, the organization that is headed by Berta Cáceres, who was assassinated because of her fight against a dam in Honduras. So now let's have the video from Lara.
Hola amigas y amigos, compañeras, compañeros, mi nombre es Carla Lara, les saludo desde Honduras, un territorio en lucha contra la sede, que son unas zonas especiales de desarrollo horrorosas, que están violando completamente nuestra soberanía nacional, pero que además es como el modelo más perverso de este capitalismo salvaje, de este capitalismo depredador. No es calentamiento global, compañeros, ustedes lo saben de sobra. Es capitalismo, es racismo, es patriarcado, es voracidad. Y bueno, me pidieron saludarles, pero también cantarles en este encuentro que están haciendo de pueblos. Creo que es muy importante el encuentro, el diálogo entre nosotras y nosotros. Creo pues ya que la posibilidad del diálogo con el gran inversionista no existe. Hay una contraposición total de la mirada del mundo, de lo que está vivo, de lo que no está vivo, de lo que somos dueños o de lo que somos parte. Y en función pues de esa enorme diferencia, creo que pues poco o nada se puede hacer en la interlocución con un sistema que no entiende nuestro discurso, nuestra palabra, nuestro sentir. Y entonces está como bien difícil, ¿verdad?, encontrarle un punto. Sin embargo, si nos encontramos nosotras y nosotros, la gente, los pueblos, las comunidades, las propuestas políticas que vienen de ahí, de nuestras luchas, de nuestros aprendizajes, ahí sí podemos construir una cosa que a lo mejor no tenga impacto mediático y esto, porque pues sí, es pequeño, porque las grandes respuestas son pequeños esfuerzos. Las grandes respuestas están en pequeñas comunidades, en pequeñas formas de adversar el modelo, que replicadas y en la suma de todas, pues realmente vamos a ir haciendo una posibilidad distinta, como así, como de gotita que va cayendo y va cayendo. Pero bueno, me pidieron también cantarles, entonces vamos a cantarles. Vamos a hacer un pequeño tema para el pueblo lenca, organizado en el Copín, y para todos los pueblos del mundo. Que corra el río, que corra. Paula en su camino y Tomás en el torrente de sus aguas. Que corra el río, Hualcarque. Tomás en su corriente y Paula en la alegría que nos baña. Una se pregunta, ¿de dónde tanta fuerza? ¿De dónde Rosalina? ¿De dónde tantas Bertas? Me contaron un secreto, son espíritus ancestros, son espíritus tan viejos que les dan fuerza a los cuerpos. De nuestra compañera Melissa Cardosa, un fragmento de este poema tan hermoso, Berta de las Aguas. Sagrada sal de nuestras luchas, lluvia sobre las milpas, fresas esparcidas en todas las manos, vida toda, Berta, compañera. ¿Qué sabrá el asesino de la luz de su palabra? No podrá asomarse el asesino y el cobarde a la utopía, ni en palabras. Muchos siglos tendrán para pagar esta muerte, y ojalá que se les pudra el agua en la garganta. Berta, Berta de las Aguas. El odio de los hombres que tanto nos señalan, no pueden con tanta belleza, con tanta fuerza, con tanta gracia. Por eso matan, sí, por eso matan. No saben no saben de esta venganza nuestra, de ser libres, sí, y de no cambiar la rebeldía por nada. Una se pregunta, ¿de dónde tanta fuerza? ¿De dónde, Pascualita? ¿De dónde tantas verdades? Me contaron que en la arena, en las venas de esta tierra, son las niñas las que juegan y les dan fuerza a las lencas. Que corra el río Gualcarque, los ríos del mundo con verdad. Gracias, compas. Feliz encuentro.
Thank you very much, Carla Lara. You know, I visited Honduras officially in November of that year, the year before she was killed, and 3 months, and she brought me to the canal, to the river where the dam was being built. And I asked her if she is under threat, and she said yes. And I was advising her to be careful. And then 3 months after, she got killed. So I returned again to her community, I think 2 years ago, to meet with her mother and sisters, just to see how they are. But that is really a very, you know, a very sad situation, but it speaks of what Indigenous peoples face when they protest and resist the projects that destroy the community. And this dam was in fact being built under the auspices that it is a solution to climate change. So even solutions, so-called solutions, are actually can bring actually death and human rights violations to Indigenous peoples. No? So now we will have the second panel, and we will be hearing from key partners of IPAF who are here with us today. And the first speaker is one from the donor, no? Olivia Forsberg, who is the focal point for IPAF, and she will join us virtually. And the question for Olivia is, could you let us know how the partnership with Indigenous peoples through IPAF fits into the SIDA strategic vision to tackle climate change, particularly on adaptation? You have the floor, Olivia.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting SIDA to participate. And thank you for the beautiful videos that you've shown. I'm very happy to see the different examples from the Batwa SSO. And I agree, the song really came to my heart with the story. So back to the partnership with IPAF. It's a great importance to SIDA as it contributes not only to poverty reduction, which is one of SIDA's main goals, but also for better food security, preservation of land rights, increased gender equality, while also protecting the environment and preserving the cultural heritage. We are all gathered here at the COP, again, due to the climate crisis. And it's a crisis that is a global emergency that also has severe impacts locally. The impacts from the increased temperatures can be seen from the Arctic to the Amazonas. And the increasing disasters caused by natural hazards hampers the food production. It disturbs market, economic development, forcing children out of schools, and causes major displacement of women, girls, boys, and men all over the world. The fragile ecosystems are at risk of overexploitation, pollutions, and increasing risk of invasive plants because it becomes hotter. Thus, building resilience towards a changing climate and natural hazards while using nature-based solutions that also protects the biodiversity is the key for a sustainable future. As mentioned before, Indigenous people live in harmony with nature and have understood the delicate balance of the ecosystems over many decades. Nature is entwined with the cultures and traditions, and therefore the right to own and access land, especially for women, remains an important concern, and it is vital for a climate-just society. At SIDA, we provide support to a broad range of organizations, both development and humanitarian, and many sorts of topics. We are working with grassroots organizations in many different countries globally. And we use the knowledge and partnership formed with our partners, such as IFAD, to also bring it into our dialogue with the global policy organizations that we're connecting with. Thus taking the local ideas, solution, and concerns to a global level. In my work with IFAD and the indigenous group leaders from Central America, they were sharing some of their experiences on pesticides and food production. And I always think in this type of events, I'm very happy to hear from local people, but I also want to give the voice to the local people as well. So they told me about pesticides and food production. Pesticides kills everything, even the good. Communities, they use flowers, garlic, chilies as natural pesticides instead, and diversify with many plants in a small space. The communities do not want to plant everything because they also want to have food for the fauna to eat. They also said, we do not produce food for the whole village, but we can feed the whole village. Now, this is an important point in understanding the protection of biodiversity and the diversifying of crops. By using the traditional knowledge and how to manage the soil in a much better way. We do have a lot to learn from Indigenous people and what the sustainable and really climate-smart solutions are. So, through SIDA's support to IFAD, as one example, it is just one of the ways that SIDA stays committed to support the voices from Indigenous people in claiming their rights, protecting the environment, while also preserving the cultural heritage. Thank you very much for your invitation to SIDA, and we're very proud of our commitment to IFAD, and we hope for a continuous good collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Indeed, the support that SIDA has provided to IFAD to give to IPAF has impacted very positively on Indigenous peoples, as you would have seen in the slides, and also the report of Jackie Macharia from Africa. So we really appreciate the support, and we hope that you will sustain the support so that Indigenous peoples can adapt further to the impacts of climate change and, of course, pursue their own self-determined development. So thank you once again. And now we will move to people who are here. We finished the virtual presentations and the video presentations. We now have people in front of you who will speak with you. And the first speaker for this part is Helen Magata, my colleague. She is also working in Tubtuba. She is our communications officer, but she is the one whom we assigned to engage actively with the Green Climate Fund. And she was the one who personally pushed for the adoption of the Indigenous Peoples policy in the Green Climate Fund. So now you can have the floor, Helen, and the main question for you is what are the main opportunities of Indigenous peoples to be able to access the climate finance?
Thank you very much, Vicky, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very glad to be part of this panel and together with this beautiful, powerful people in front. So yeah, in terms of Indigenous people's access to climate finance, I think it would be important for us when we talk about opportunities to look at what the Paris Agreement itself has in place. So the Paris Agreement preamble says that any climate action that the states should do should make sure to include traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples and make sure that they do not violate Indigenous peoples' rights. So in terms of legal framework, we have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which sets the minimum standard for what Indigenous peoples' rights should be, the minimum standards that states and other actors should be looking at in terms of Indigenous peoples. So when we also look at different climate financing institutions, they have different policies, but they have environmental and social safeguards in place. For example, I know that IFAD have their policy on engagement with Indigenous peoples. We have, for example, in the performance standards, for example, of the climate investment funds. For the Green Climate Fund, they have their own Indigenous peoples policy. So one opportunity is that to make sure that beyond paper, we have to operationalize what is on paper in terms of safeguard, making sure that Indigenous peoples really do access climate finance and ensuring that these policies work. Second, we know that there's a lot of there's a lot of pledges in COP26, $1.7 billion for forest and Indigenous peoples. But I think one opportunity that needs to be looked at is that how much of this climate finance actually goes to Indigenous peoples and are directly accessed by Indigenous peoples themselves. So direct access of climate finance for Indigenous peoples have lots of opportunities to offer for them to be able to strengthen and continue practicing their traditional knowledge, and also for this to be transmitted to younger generation. For example, land tenure. We know that 80% of the remaining forest biodiversity are in Indigenous peoples' territories. But how much percentage of this remaining forests are really legally recognized by states, for example? So that's one big opportunity. Loss and damage. We do not have any agenda in the COP for loss and damage, especially loss and damage that looks into non-economic loss and damages by Indigenous peoples. There are a lot of indicators which are beyond economic indicators. Another one is on Indigenous women. Indigenous peoples have a lot of intersectionalities, one of which is, being an Indigenous woman is really difficult in terms of accessing climate finance. Another one is capacity building. So there is really a lot of opportunities in terms of defining what climate finance can do to Indigenous peoples. In terms of modalities, I think we can also look at different examples of both United Nations, UN, and also multilateral organizations out there in terms of how they are providing finance for Indigenous peoples. We have the dedicated grants mechanism. We have, for example, the small grants program of the GEF. But beyond this, the Indigenous Peoples Assistance Facility of IFAD, for example, but beyond this, there are also other funds out there who are doing small grants for Indigenous peoples and doing a lot, really, as we have seen in the videos. But I think the one thing that I also would like to highlight is the opportunity from Indigenous peoples themselves in terms of creating networks and alliances. So this is the opportune time actually to redefine climate change from the perspectives of Indigenous peoples, and also look at how climate finance is being measured beyond carbon and beyond the number of beneficiaries, to include indicators of how, it's not just about breadth and scope, but also more about depth. So we can say small is also beautiful. Thank you, and over.
Thank you very much. Indeed, if you remember the song sung to us by Carla, she mentioned about small, no, that small efforts result to big things. So that's really a good point to always reiterate. Because they always think that indigenous peoples are not able to do all this. But actually, a lot of the work that's done by indigenous peoples is because they prefer to be small, they prefer to work in their own communities and bring out more concrete results. No? Now we have Eileen Mayrena Cunningham, who is part of the global advocacy team of the Ilatia Partnership. You know, we have an Ilatia Partnership, which is a partnership of indigenous peoples engaged in climate change, sustainable development, and forests. No, and Eileen is part of that team, and she is also the active observer for the Green Climate Fund from the developing countries. So she is now the one reading all the projects of the Green Climate Fund to see whether these are doing good for indigenous peoples. So Eileen, having been working in that arena, can you tell us what are the main challenges that indigenous peoples face as far as direct access to climate finance is concerned?
Thank you, Vicky. Yeah, thank you to all of you to be here. Really, I think one of the first challenges, and we can see it here in these global meetings, is about the discourse that these people that are taking the decision have. One of the first things you see is there is not, indigenous people issues are invisible in this discourse. And that also came when we see, if we are not in the discourse of the decision maker, they don't take decision to open the possibility to indigenous people to have direct access to funds. Right now, there is a different financial mechanism, and one of these is the Green Climate Fund that we work on this following. And what we see is a lot of challenge. And I'm very happy that Helen was talking about opportunities, because there is still a lot of challenge that we want to know. One of these, of course, is this lack of recognition of this solution and contribution of indigenous people to the climate change issue. So normally when they talk about financial climate, they just think about numbers and not about this other part that indigenous people see in a holistic way, the spiritual part, the importance for the living of agriculture. So that is also one of the gap. And of course, there is a lot of problems about the way all these mechanisms, financial mechanisms are structured. First of all, if we see just the language when they speak about financial climate, it's in English. The Green Climate Fund discussion is always in English. So then you have a lack for those indigenous people that doesn't speak English from Latin America, from Africa or Asia. That is the first barrier that we found there. And then most of the discussion also is also the other thing about the state. The Green Climate Fund defined that a funding proposal have to bring a non-objection letter from our states for our national designated authorities. And there is a lot of countries around the world where indigenous people are not recognized, and the state have a very bad relationship with us. So how come we're going to have access to this fund? Because there is not a direct window or a direct access window for us if we also don't have this relationship with the state. And one of the main problems there is most of the NDAs, or National Designated Authority, are financial ministers, that they don't know about indigenous people, or they don't want to know also, and they don't include the issues of right in their work. So it's very difficult to come to this space and try to include the indigenous people issues. Also, I think when we talk about direct access to funds, we can see that it's difficult to indigenous people organization to be accredited in the Green Climate Fund, for example. And if we say indigenous people organization, if we see the communities or the territories that are on the ground, it's almost impossible. These structures have a very difficult architecture with some very high standard, fiduciary standard that indigenous people cannot fulfill. So for now, it's very difficult. And I think Helen talked about opportunities around this. It's important to see other examples that are around the world, even examples that are led by Indigenous Peoples Foundation. And also the asymmetry of the GCF funding sizes. When they see this small, even we say small, it's beautiful, but GCF adaptation fund, they see this small example. They say this, even the accredited entity, they are not interested in funding this kind of project. And we really are happy that IFAD and other friendly UN system organizations are working with indigenous people. And one of the last thing I want to bring here is about, now the Green Climate Fund have this indigenous people policy. It's a very strong and robust tool, but most of the accredited entities see this like a perverse incentive for them. They try not to comply with this indigenous people policy, and we have been very pushy in the Green Climate Fund through the small team and also with the CSO, because they bring this funding proposal, but in this funding proposal, they are not taking into account the indigenous people, even if they're there. So it's also lack of capacity of the Secretariat of the Green Climate Fund, that they have to really see that this accredited entity comply with this indigenous people policy. And I think we can talk about a lot of challenges, but it's important to see also, it's important to see all the opportunities that are around. It's not only the bad examples. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eileen. You know, if there are people who would like to ask questions, you can use the Zoom to ask questions using the question and answer button, or to use Vevox app in the room. I don't know what Vevox app is, but anyhow, those who want to ask questions, you can go to the IFAD people in the back and ask them how to do it. Now, I would like to move to the young people. No, as you can see, we have women, we have young people, because we always think that the contributions of both the women, the elders, and the young people are very important. And I would like to ask our young persons, Carson Kiburo and Victor Carmen, who are the members of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. And they are here to talk to us about what are their priorities as far as the youth are concerned. No? So you can divide the time between the two of you and share what you think are the priorities that you have heard from the indigenous youth that you are working with. So would Victor, maybe you go ahead, and then let's go to Carson afterwards.
Sure. Thank you so much, Vicky, and it's really an honor to be with everyone here today. I'm going to take this off because I'm getting a background, but like I said, it's truly an honor to be here with everyone. You know, our elders are so strong. They teach us so many things, and they're a great example for us Indigenous youth to follow. And our heart goes out to them for all the work that they've done, for us to be sitting right here in these seats. We know that, you know, the challenges that you faced to get the Indigenous Peoples platforms here at COP may have seemed insurmountable, but you transcended those challenges with so much grace, and we're so thankful for all that you've done up to this point. As Indigenous youth and as co-chair of Indigenous Youth Caucus with my brother Carson here, we speak with Indigenous youth and we work with Indigenous youth from all over the world. And we've heard of many of the challenges that Indigenous youth specifically face in regarding to climate change. And to talk to you about these challenges, I want to talk to you about a ceremony. This past year, I participated in a ceremony, a traditional ceremony, which is one of the 7 sacred ceremonies of my tribe. And during this ceremony, our elders would speak to us in our indigenous language. They would use words for certain animals or certain plants in our indigenous language. And I'm Hunkpati Dakota. I'm a member of the Crow Creek Sioux tribe. My Dakota name is Wa'oki Amani, which means my way of life is to help. My walk of life is to help. My English name is Victor. But when I went to this ceremony in South Dakota, the elders used words in our language that if I didn't know those words, that would be a piece of knowledge that I may have never got to learn ever again. If I didn't know my language, I would not have been able to pick up this traditional knowledge. And so language is a priority that I've heard time and time again that Indigenous youth are stressing, because in order for us to learn the traditional knowledge of many of our elders, we need to be able to speak our language, because that is the language that they speak. Oftentimes they don't speak English, or there isn't a word that they can use in English to get across the lesson that they want to teach us. There are other things in the ceremony that I saw. For instance, we use buffalo, tatanka in our language, in the ceremony, traditional buffalo. It wasn't long ago that the US government implemented a policy to try to exterminate the buffalo because that was one of our traditional food sources. And in a way to try to exterminate the ceremonies that we use the buffalo for. And in a way to exterminate the way that we live. We made our teepees out of buffalo. We ate our food and we used them in our ceremonies. And these policies, their implications.
The sound is gone. I think. No, just a second. We cannot hear you. Yeah, okay.
We want countries to realize that this history is still alive and the Indigenous youth are still facing the impacts. So when you fund initiatives, for instance, my tribes are beginning to restore the buffalo. We're beginning to bring the buffalo back into our land. And when you invest in initiatives like that, you're recognizing that that is not a donation, it is a responsibility based on real policy actions that governments have taken that are still impacting our health and our climate today and our land. In order for us to bring back the buffalo to use in the ceremony that I participate in, we require you to recognize our tenure of the land. We require you to recognize our rights to the land because the buffalo need land in order to roam. For these ceremonies, we learn respect for water. We learn respect for elders. The buffalo, they need water in order to be on the land. That water needs to be clean in order for them to be on the land. Without clean water, we cannot have this very important aspect of our traditional ceremony. There are many different ways that we think about our rights, the climate, and I think in the Western way, they like to delineate climate change into many different sectors, into health, into education. But for us, it's very integrated. And Indigenous youth, we want governments, we want UN agencies to start to see that interconnectedness and to invest in Indigenous youth in this way that respects that when you invest in us in one way, it helps us in so many other ways. I'll end it there so my brother Carson can give us some knowledge. But thank you so much to IFAD for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Victor. Now we move to Carson. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Does this work or I can use this one? It works? Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you so much, my brother Victor. As you've heard, my name is Carson Kiburo. We are privileged together to serve the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus as the co-chairs. I come from Kenya, and I am of the Indorois as well, and I am a pastoralist. Just like the Maasai that you have heard in Kenya, I also come, they are our distant cousins. A story by my brother Victor is a very powerful story that gives a global outlook of the indigenous peoples across the world. It gives the story that we face, the story about our preservation and transmission of our knowledge systems, and how we use language as a powerful tool in intricately linking culture and our life, our livelihoods. And so I will leave the story part because he has given a very good picture of what we go through or what we want. And we'll go directly to what we think we came here with. We're very grateful to IFAD, first of all. IFAD gave us an opportunity to be here, to showcase and to have a mission as well, and to make sure that our goals are achieved. We want to build our capacity on the process, on the climate change processes. That is the most important thing. In this event, we have over 20,000 people, I heard, that have been accredited. But if you look, the indigenous youth are probably less than 50 out of the 20,000. And so building that capacity, that we want to build our capacity to be able to participate in these processes. And you've heard from the panel here, our sister here, Helen, and even Eileen. The problem is access to these mechanisms. And we've tried, but we're still trying to build our capacities. Also, we are trying to bilaterally build partnerships that can be able to help our people and the young people from the indigenous peoples to be able to participate in these rights. We're lobbying for, most importantly, that I need to mention here, and it's something that is ongoing right now, but we know that it's beyond our lobbying. Together with our elders and the experienced negotiators, we were trying to make sure that Article 6, human rights text, is inserted as a text. And we know that it's something very hard for civil society and NGOs to be able to participate in these spaces without the human rights-based approach. It would have enabled, and it will be possible, it would enable us to access the climate financing, for example. You have heard about those bottlenecks. We are being, the kind of challenges that are there, the hurdles that have been put. It's impossible for indigenous youth to access these funds, for example, the climate funds. And on Friday, I mentioned about, my brother was not yet here, I mentioned about climate justice, the climate action being equivalent to climate justice. And there is no climate justice without climate financing, which also goes into another layer of climate literacy. So for us to do that, we're trying to make sure that these pieces of puzzles are put together to make sure that the indigenous youth and their peoples and their communities that they come from get access to these. And I see that my time is over, but I'm going to mention that we had about the $1.7 billion that was pledged. Out of the $100 billion, we believe that this $1.7 billion we can access even from our communities without these bottlenecks that you've heard from our friends. And I want to challenge all of you about one thing. I know most of you come from the member states, and some come from the UN bodies that are here. The most important thing that I want you to take home from this discussion, we're not pushing you to the wall. We just want to discuss. Think about the link to nature. Think about how we have let the world know that we have existed with nature since time immemorial. From my own community, there is a powerful link between the nature and biodiversity and us. For example, my totem is the moon, my father's clan, and my mother's clan is from, identifies with the crane. And there is a special and a sacred way that we link together. And so we're not talking just about the human rights-based approach, But we also want you, as part of the human family, to think about that. Let's just be human and make sure that the planet, we survive, because the planet will be there even if we misbehave, okay? And so that's all that I have today. I'm really grateful to IFAD team for this support and to be able to speak on behalf of Indigenous youth globally with my brother here, Victor, and the rest of Indigenous youth who are tuning in and are listening. We appreciate the opportunity. Peace and blessings to you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carson and Victor. So you heard our youth. If this is the kind of youth that we have, we will have hope that things are really going to change and they will be able to do what they can to transform society towards a more sustainable and humane future. You also mentioned about language. You know, that's one of the main reasons why we lobbied very strongly the UN to declare an International Year of Indigenous Languages. And from 2022 to 2032, it's the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. No? And this is important for the young people as well. It's an opportunity for the elders to transmit their languages to the youth. You know, many of our young people now don't speak the language because of the discrimination that they have been facing, but also the capacity to transmit this. So it's very good that you mentioned about language, that it contains the concepts and the cosmologies that we believe in, and we are not just transmitting the language per se, but the thoughts, the philosophies, and the ideas that our elders have taught us. Now we have a few questions. We still have time. And I'll read the 3 questions and then I'll ask any of you to respond to this. So one question is, what are the major challenges and opportunities existing at the interface between climate and nutrition, as well as between climate and youth in the small island developing states? No? Nobody is from the small island developing states, but maybe you, but the Philippines is also an island. We have 7,100 islands, so maybe you can also respond to that. But the other 2 questions is, a lot of these countries not only have climate change to deal with, but are also affected by COVID-19. How have they been affected and what has been the worst for them? Effects of climate change or COVID-19? And finally, the other question is, what is the biggest climate change threat to each of our panelists and what can they do to adapt to it? Is it seeds, tools, trainings? Maybe I'll start with Helen. Maybe you can respond to the question about COVID-19. What is worse, but also to talk about the impacts. We did a research on COVID-19 and how it affects Indigenous peoples. So let's start with Helen and then I'll call the others as we move. Okay.
Thank you so much, Vicky. Let me just remove it. I cannot remove it. Now it's stuck. Okay. Anyway, so about COVID-19, I think it's difficult to talk about COVID-19 without actually linking it to climate change. Challenges of Indigenous peoples. We know that COVID-19 is very much related to how our climate works. And many scientific researchers are already out there saying that COVID-19 actually was caused by the disruption of how our world and biodiversity works. So how has Indigenous peoples been affected by COVID-19 and what is worse, COVID-19 or climate change? I think we cannot talk of them, as I said, separately, in silo, especially for Indigenous peoples. In my country, for example, and in the countries where we had our research about the impacts of COVID-19, like climate change, Indigenous peoples are suffering or are among the most vulnerable to impacts of both climate and COVID-19. And on top of that, they're also suffering from persecutions and human rights violations by state-imposed mechanisms to supposedly solve or curb the COVID-19 transmission in communities. So we have heard how Indigenous peoples communities have been ravaged by extractive industry activities during the lockdowns. So when Indigenous peoples were on community lockdowns, that's when the militaries came, for example, to do extractive industries. And a lot of Indigenous peoples are also persecuted and also criminalized just because they have to go out and hunt and gather food in areas that are their territories. And these are supposedly against community protocols or state-imposed protocols. So I would say that both COVID-19 and climate change have the same impacts and also have the same threats to Indigenous peoples, although they might look different, but they're actually the same. And in terms of how climate change is affecting nutrition of Indigenous peoples, this is closely related to rights of Indigenous peoples to food sovereignty and access to their lands. Yes. So and I think Vicky is going to add more to that. Thanks.
Well, I just wanted to say something that's positive as well. You know, Indigenous peoples have also their own traditional systems of dealing with epidemics and in pestilence. I speak for my community. I come from a community which has 7,000 people, and since we were kids, we have been doing lockdowns. Whenever there is an epidemic, people are not allowed to go in and out, and so we did this, and now we have the record of only having 2 deaths and 100 cases. And many of our people are also using the traditional medicines to be able to boost up the immunity of the Indigenous peoples in our community. So I think there are very adverse impacts, but there are also activities undertaken by Indigenous peoples using their traditional knowledge again. No, so I'll move to the young people. Maybe how do you link nutrition also and the issue of climate change? So maybe you can talk about the food systems as well, no? Victor, and try to be brief because we will be closing very soon. 2 minutes, yeah, we have 2 minutes to speak, yeah? Okay.
Yeah, so during the pandemic, well, first of all, I'm a medical student. Currently, I'm a 3rd-year medical student. So I kind of got to see both worlds, how my tribes were dealing with the pandemic and then sort of how the medical community was responding. And I think that from my perspective in terms of nutrition, food systems have not really been respected by the medical community, the Western medical community, as a vital mode of Indigenous health, even during the pandemic. I think that, food sovereignty, how often do you hear physician groups, physician advocacy groups, doctor advocacy groups, medical societies talking about Indigenous access to land, Indigenous food sovereignty? And what did we see during the pandemic? A lot of food insecurity in Indigenous communities because Indigenous people's rights to their food sovereignty have been disenfranchised in a systemic manner. So I think the medical community, from my perspective, needs to start taking this a lot more seriously and start to integrate these sort of this way of thinking as a real way to improve Indigenous health and a way to improve Indigenous health, especially during the pandemics.
Carson, your last words? Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna have to use the mic. Okay, thank you. Quickly, I will go with the first things first. I'm not a medical doctor like my brother here, but there's something that I can mention that my community has observed over the last 2 decades. We've seen, this is on nutrition-related diseases. We've seen increased cases of cancer, brucellosis, high blood pressure, diabetes, things that were not there before. I am a young person, but I get stories from my elders. And so We know that there are so many of these Western-related or over-commercialized, industrialized food systems, or a lot of chemicals that are being brought into our food systems or food system. Another thing that I should mention, because of the time, is about the climate and COVID-19. We could not visit our communities during the pandemic because we could not visit each other. Ceremonies were not being able to be conducted. But most importantly, the link between the climate and climate adaptation and the COVID. So we had to adapt to the most pressing matter, the urgent matter at that time. Both of them are very urgent, the climate action and the pandemic, but we had to survive first things first. So like our elder right there, Vicky said, the most important thing was survival, nothing else. And then we have to think about the planet, but survival was the most important thing. Isolation, not visiting each other. I'll tell you a story in maybe 10 seconds. I was not able to visit my own parents because the lockdown got me in the city. And when my dad told me, you can stay there, you cannot do your farming that you are used to, send us the money, we can help you, but just stay where you are. I felt something funny, but it was the most, when I thought about preserving the living libraries that we have, including my own dad, who is 80 years old, I felt like this is the most important thing to do. Just stay away until everything else subsides and then go back home. Back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carson. And now last words, Eileen.
I just want to add in the last question about climate change threats for us. I think one of the main issues is that there is a lack of recognition and lack of discussion about human rights and the rights of indigenous people in all this discussion now. So that is for now one of the biggest threats. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you very much, Eileen. We would now move to Myrna Cunningham, who will close this session. Myrna is an indigenous Miskita from Nicaragua. She is a very well-known indigenous rights activist, the former chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and she is the chair of the steering committee of the IPAF in IFAD, and a board member of the Indigenous Peoples Assistance Facility. So are we getting Myrna on the, there Myrna is there. So Myrna, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. And thank you to all of these excellent panelists. I'm calling from Nicaragua, from the autonomous regions, in the North Autonomous Region of Nicaragua. So I bring you greetings from all of the Miskito indigenous communities and Afro-descendants communities. And of course, I bring you greetings from the steering committee of indigenous peoples that have been set up to follow up on the recommendations that we give and we present to the Governing Council of IFAD every 2 years. As we have seen during this discussion, we have been able to build a strong partnership between indigenous peoples and IFAD. And we started this partnership addressing this important issue that Eileen mentioned at the end, how an institution, an organization like IFAD can really respect indigenous peoples. And we started assessing some of their projects because we said if IFAD was created to reduce and alleviate poverty in the rural area, how are they doing this? So we started more than 10 years ago. And during these 10 years, we have been able to work together to create a policy that recognizes indigenous people's rights, free, prior, and informed consent, participation, gender balance, respect of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this policy has several instruments. And one of the instruments is our forum that we meet every 2 other years with staff and governing council and make recommendations and define regional plan of actions, but the other instrument is IPAF. And today we heard about IPAF, this facility that really contribute to empower indigenous grassroots organization that strengthen indigenous people's network and organization at the regional level, because it linked these local organizations with regional networks and global networks. It also support cross-cutting issues. We saw gender, we saw youth participation, but it also support partnership and fund mobilizations. The local partners, once they receive a support from IPAF, they develop their financial capacity, their mobilization of resource capacity, and they can access other resources. But we also saw that the IPAF funds can also support innovation, sustainability to tackle with issues like climate change. Today, we are in this discussion in the context of climate change negotiation and the discussion on adaptation. It's very well documented, and there's enough evidence that can prove that indigenous organizations really have the capacity to adapt when they're faced with climate change. And I would say the first element that we saw during this discussion is intergenerational transmission of knowledge. This is the first component of adaptation and resilience for indigenous peoples organization. Mobility. Their measures that they adapt are related with their territory, with their land, with their livelihood systems. But we also saw that it's related with art, with culture, with language, with spirituality, and it's also related with traditional knowledge. All of this is based on traditional knowledge that has been proven through generation that it can help to solve problems. So I do want to end by discussing on access to finance for indigenous peoples. We know that when we review, for example, access to funding for land tenure, 1% of the resources goes to indigenous peoples. So our big struggle now is to develop capacity in our organizations to be able to receive funds directly. And we have created different mechanisms, and one of them are the indigenous-led funds. And IPAF is an indigenous-led fund that is in IFAD. And this partnership between indigenous peoples and IFAD to channel fund can help to address the opportunity. We see 3 opportunities: recovery, post-COVID recovery. The countries are anxious to find solution to COVID recovery. But if they, in finding and looking for these solutions, they really go back to the old model of development, this will not be possible. And of course, we heard about the Green Climate Fund. So let's make use of this opportunity, this partnership between IFAD and indigenous peoples channeling resources through IPAF. Thank you very much, Vicky. And thank you, all the panelists.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the panelists who have spoken virtually and also are here physically: Carson, Victor, Helen, and Eileen, and Olivia, and Jackie, as well as the videos that were presented. I would like to thank IFAD who co-organized this with Tabtaba and also with FILAC for this event. I hope we will be able to see positive results from this in terms of increased resources for EPAF and more people supporting us from EPAF. Thank you very much, and I really appreciate you coming here and listening to all of us. Thank you and goodbye.